Native American mythology is diverse and breathtaking. Each tribe has such fascinating and often beautiful folklore, but with the joyful and captivating mythology comes darker and often terrifying myths. Even to this day, some of these myths become real, from supernatural spirits and monsters to prolific killers you wish you never met. Today, we will be talking about one of these stories. We call them the Draggers. It's a legend passed down from generation to generation on my reservation. And yet almost all the people on our reservation today have never heard of the legend. Only a few remaining families still tell the story to their children and their children's children. To be honest with you, it's a story I even nearly forgot having been told by my grandmother as a small child. I hadn't heard the story told again until I went searching for it in my late 30s after experiencing the most horrific moment of my life. There exists a few miles of desert in one direction of our reservation. As the story goes, the people of my tribe roamed these parts far and wide for centuries. They knew to never wander the desert, as the dreadful heat of the day and the polar cold of the night would likely be your end. But there was another threat that often exited that desert, but always returned, dragging one of the tribe into the dunes: coyotes. Modern coyotes are so docile that even though I was young and impressionable, at the time when I first heard the story, I immediately refused to believe that coyotes of all things would be as aggressive as the story portrayed. And yet the legend goes that coyotes would stalk the village at night, looking for unattended children or infants to grab and drag away, whilst the coyotes' companions would growl or attack or distract the family members that attempted to stop the dragger coyote. That is why they called them the Draggers. These starved and desperate coyotes would drag infants into the desert, where they were never seen again. And often, those who followed with an impassioned attempt to rescue their loved ones would also become lost to the extreme temperatures of the dunes. Believe the legend or don't, that's up to you. It is simply the tragic and terrifying story that my family continues to share to this day. As kids, my cousins and I thought the story was nothing more than a cautionary tale, an attempt to keep us from wandering around at night, and to keep us from exploring that desert. It's funny how a place so obviously dangerous and treacherous is somehow tempting to a child. There were times in my youth where we would ignore the warnings and we would adventure out into the dunes after nightfall. Usually we would hear the howls of the coyotes and turn back reminded of the story of the Draggers. But on one brave occasion, in which we went a bit too far, we stumbled upon coyote tracks and ran back laughing at our bravery or stupidity. Now, growing up usually brings with it wisdom and experience, but that is not always the case. After all, it was my sober decision to set out into the dunes myself for a camping trip, to be alone with myself after a particularly rough year at work. I had a few days of vacation to use, and I used it to return to nature. The legend of the Draggers was but a distant memory at that point. Even if the legend had been recalled randomly in my head, I wouldn't be able to recall much detail about it. Coyotes or something, I probably would have said. Memory is a fragile thing as the years go by, frustratingly so. I set out on a clear Tuesday afternoon. I paid close attention to the weather forecast for the area, and I wanted clear and moderate temperatures if I could help it. Any foul weather in a place of extreme temperatures would force my outing to an early end, and I was afraid. Luckily, it was supposed to be clear. I settled in an area that wasn't too far from a frequented dirt road. That road wouldn't be more than a mile out if I recall correctly. That particular spot would also make remembering the direction of the road simple due to the shape of the dunes around me. The plan was not to sleep on the sand. Rather, I'd set up in my Jeep with a snug little covered sleeping area in the back. It was a 4x4 with nearly new tires, so traversing the dunes would not be a problem either. Well, I spent the remainder of the daylight reading on my Amazon Kindle, listening to the wind blow through the sandy mounds. When the sun began to dip, I built a fire from the logs I'd brought along. Dinner was deer steak that my mother always cooked so well, fried squash, and some beef franks that I roasted on a stick. Sounds like a lot of meat, but I would not go camping without having a camping snack. But maybe I should have brought marshmallows. As night approached, it was a far more refreshing trip than I even expected it to be. When the day got too hot, the night came along to cool it down, and when I got too cold, I just sit a little bit closer to the fire. That night, the desert seemed to be the least dangerous place I'd ever been. Crossing a street in town would be infinitely more risky than this, I thought to myself, thinking back on all the warnings my family had given me as a child over the years. On the other hand, it still made sense. After all, I wouldn't allow my own children to explore the desert on their own. Perhaps growing up into a more understanding and skillful adult had allowed me to enjoy and respect the desert more. I lay back on the sand near the precarious fire pit. I closed my eyes for a little while. I wasn't tired yet, I was just thinking about my childhood for a bit. Nostalgia had come flooding my heart and mind as I sat in a familiar yet wondrous setting. Even still, I found myself dozing off. Guess I was too comfortable. My eyes tore open at the sound as it echoed and bounced over the dunes and into my campsite. The jitter of my heart, my sudden rapid panting, it felt as if I had awakened from a nightmare. But as I recalled, I hadn't had a nightmare. No, I recognized the sound that woke me. Coyote howls, dog-like brethren calling out under the moonlight, signaling each other some unknown information. I placed my palms on the sand, gripping it with my fingers, squeezing my eyes shut. I reminded myself that coyotes were no danger to people these days, that a case of someone being attacked by a coyote in my tribe had never happened as long as I'd been alive. My heart rested, and my breathing slowed. Nothing to worry about. I shook some sand from my hair. I didn't mean to fall asleep on the ground, and then I picked myself up and carried myself into the back of my Jeep Wrangler. The rear of my Jeep had no glass windows, so I would be very much exposed to the cold night air. But that was fine. I was overheating from the fire anyway, so I wanted to cool down some. Plus, I had a number of blankets, one of which was heated and plugged right into my Jeep's power outlets thanks to a handy adapter. Fire still crackling near the Jeep on the ground, I lay my head down onto a pillow and closed my eyes. Despite my rest having been interrupted before, and feeling more tired than I'd been in weeks, I could not go back to sleep. I must have leaned there, tossing and turning. Eyes remained closed for a few hours before I just gave up and stared up at the stars. As I wondered if I should put my headphones in and play some music from my phone, I heard a new sound from the darkness of the desert. A child crying. A single eyebrow raised. I lifted myself up and I looked around. It sounded fairly close. Was some family out there camping as well? The crying didn't stop. Instead, it drew closer, ever so slowly, as the sound of the coyotes roared around it. As the minutes ticked past and I began to grow annoyed by the unwanted chorus of the night, I made a startling discovery. The crying came from the same direction and slowly seemed to approach. The coyote howls were steadily converging, fusing together behind the sounds of the child's cry. I stared into darkness toward the direction of the sounds, until maybe 20 minutes later, they all had combined into one harmonious sound of layered voices. Many coyote howls, one child's cry, all coming closer by the second. My mouth had fallen wide open as I jumped from the Jeep and nearly tripped when my foot caught in my blanket. I wasn't sure why, but I felt as if I desperately needed to put out the fire and drive away in my Jeep. Something deep, something primal in me demanded that I stay no longer here. As I started to kick sand awkwardly into the fire to no avail, thanks to one of my feet being asleep, I found it was too late when a figure emerged from the dark at the side of one of the nearby dunes. I saw paws, first 4 paws, leaving slow, deliberate tracks in the sand beneath it as it traversed down the steep mound. It seemed to be approaching the fire, and I was happy that it didn't seem too interested in me. But I had never heard of wildlife approaching a person next to a fire without any caution. I thought to myself, shouldn't it be scared of the flames? Scared of a human? Taking a step back, I kept a distance from the coyote. As it approached my campsite at a frustratingly slow speed, it took another minute or two just to reveal the rest of itself into the light of the campfire. And when it did, I screamed and fell to the ground. My hands flew behind me, searching as I grasped at more solid ground to pull myself backwards. Yet all I found was a sea of loose, soft sand. The coyote's furry body ended, or rather began at a disturbing point. Its face was not a coyote at all, but human. Specifically, its face was that of a newborn baby, yet the bottom half was still the lower jaw of a coyote. The human face seemed to replace the top half of the head and snout where the nose and eyes would be. I could see its mouth open in a pant as the human face looked into the fire, the flame dancing across its tormented newborn eyes. With each step, the lower canine jaw opened and the baby's cry came dribbling out of it. Behind it, as if somehow miles back in the desert, still dozens of coyotes' howls accompanied. The creature approached the fire at a snail's pace over the course of what must have been 5 minutes. It made it close enough to the flames to where it seemed satisfied. Then it sat as a dog would, on its haunches, its panting slowing as the heat apparently pleased it. It had wandered into a freezing desert to find solace and comfort in the heat of my fire. I soon remembered that I was still struggling to make sense of the situation from my position on the ground. I swallowed hard, forcing bile back into my stomach that desperately wanted to rise up out of fear. As I stood, causing the sands beneath me to falter, the coyote thing took notice of me. The baby's eyes looked right into mine for the very first time. I'll never forget that moment. Its lower jaw slacked open and became motionless. As a childlike voice whispered from it, it said, "Mama." I left the fire ablaze, scrambling like a madman into my Jeep. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call for someone on my cell phone, but I could not pull my mind away from its focus to escape. And so I did. I drove as fast as I could in the direction of the road, coming disturbingly close to flipping the Jeep on a few occasions. When sand turned to dirt under the tire, I began to cry and smile. Though I no longer lived there, I floored it back to the reservation and stayed the night with my mother, who still called the place her home. She asked what brought me to her house so late in the night. She queried me why I looked so tired and scared and why I was covered in sand. I sat down on our couch and I spilled everything to the elderly loving woman. After bombarding her with the most unbelievable ghost story that was my night camping, she nodded and seemed almost unfazed. "Your grandmother spoke to me of such things. When she was still with us, you remember the legend of the draggers, don't you?" Covered in a cold sweat and my mouth agape, I nodded repeatedly. "Well, then you should understand this encounter entirely. Yeah, let me get you some tea." She sat up and walked into the kitchen. What did that mean, I wondered? How can I understand something so out of this world? After a few seconds, she returned with a hot cup of tea and sat down again. I drank as she smirked at my still confused expression. "Ah, you still don't get it?" I shook my head. Our people have always believed in the spirits of the land, spirits of the water, wind, fire, even of the earth and desert. When someone was taken from this world too soon, when a person passed away suddenly and in pain or torment, sometimes a part of them would stay behind, and it only makes sense that you would see what you saw out there. After all, it was likely the remains of a child stolen from its mother, devoured alive by the draggers, abandoned on this earth and forced to wander the colds of the desert. And there you were, with the source of heat in the desert hell. My mind reeled. She made my crazy story sound sane, even poetic, and it actually made sense. My fear began to wane and the feeling of deep sadness replaced it. That creature meant no harm, I think, despite its frightening appearance. Then again, I can't help but wonder what might have transpired instead if I had successfully put out the fire. Or if I'd worn my headphones in the Jeep like I tried to. What would have happened if I never knew it was coming? This is my parents' story, and it took place in Colorado many years ago and back before I was even born. They're both natives and have always been a very superstitious pair that might have just saved their lives that night. They were traveling along $1 Million Highway through Red Mountain Pass after a long road trip. It was around 2 or 3 a.m. Me and my dad were behind the wheel while my mom slept in the passenger seat. They both knew the road well, and my dad was driving cautiously. The road is notoriously dangerous for its lack of guardrails and sheer steep drops over the edge. At one point, my dad nudges my mom awake. There's something not quite right about the road up ahead. After letting her eyes adjust for a moment, she could see that the road ahead was different than usual. After having driven the road so many times before, they both knew that the sharp left curve that they were approaching was going the opposite way than it should have been. This part of the road was meant to curve right around the mountain. Always had, always would. Even the sign they just passed said so. Neither of them knew what to say as they approached the bend in the road. They both rubbed their eyes, but they're not seeing things. The road really is turning left, not right, but that was impossible. The silence was killing them, and they reached the point of no return. Mom screamed to turn right instead. She needn't have bothered, as Dad was already spinning the wheel in that direction, knowing that was how the road was supposed to go. As he turned, the actual road seemed to appear in front of them, just how it had always been. The road that was left was now just gone, as if it had never been there to begin with, and all that was left in its place was a sheer drop. Had they followed the illusionary road that they both saw, they would have plunged over the side of the mountain. Dad maintains that this was some sort of trickster, trying to force them off the side of the cliff and into an early grave. My nephew and I still talk about this experience from time to time, about something we witnessed one night. We were Native American from a reservation in Canada. It happened quite a while back, maybe 14 years ago, maybe more. I can't recall exactly, but I know it was a long time ago, when we were younger and we had the house to ourselves. While I was watching TV one night, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, as if I was sensing something that wasn't right. My nephew came knocking on the door and allowed himself into the house. He then said to me, "Uncle, I heard someone crying by the road. I was just walking along the driveway. Maybe they're drunk or something." Now, we do have the occasional drunk visitor, which is really annoying, and I don't drink myself. So I went outside to have a cigarette and check this out. My nephew came along, and I asked him whereabout he heard the crying coming from. And as he pointed in the direction that he had heard it from, I heard it for myself. It was coming from a field that led close to my uncle's house. My uncle was a cattle farmer. Now, I didn't have a gun or a bow at the time, so I decided to grab a baseball bat from the storage room and my bear spray. I do a lot of hiking and the area has bears from time to time. They do come into the yard or get too close and the dogs would chase them off, or they would bark nonstop, letting us know that they were there. I gave my nephew the bear spray and a Maglite flashlight. I mentioned it could be lynx as they were seen here from time to time as well. When I was going to tell him to keep an eye out for eye shine, we both saw eyes shine. And whatever those eyes belonged to, it wasn't a lynx, nor was it a normal animal. Wendigo is talked about in our culture, but many assume it's just a tale to tell around the campfire. But upon seeing this, it may just be true, because what we saw in front of us no less than 30 feet away, sitting like a frog would, was something that was grayish or pale and thin, and looked like it was starving, as its bones were noticeable through its emaciated frame, and had fairly large eyes that appeared black with no pupils. More curious than afraid and likely just plain stupid, I chuckle to myself now writing this, but I approached it. It backed up in a way that resembled a crab going backwards into the tall grass with cattails. It was a marshy type area. I went to the spot it had been moments before, and I noticed where the water it had stepped, the mud was kicked up and disturbed. But where the thing had been, it had left no signs of which direction it went. All I could see was the bottom of the pond water. I went back to where my nephew stood, and we stood back to back, watching out. We didn't know if we were fine or if we were just getting ambushed by this thing. I was still in that moment of disbelief of what I had just seen, and my nephew began to shine the flashlight around to try and spot wherever it may have went. He stopped when he had shown the light on it. He found it, and we saw it standing upright by the fence line that bordered off the farm from my dad's. It was standing sideways from us, a bit hunched over and slowly tilting its head in our direction to look at us. Despite us shining the light right on it, it just vanished. We didn't even see it run or move, and it was gone. We shined the light everywhere again, trying to see where we would spot it next. And I told my nephew we should get back to the house right now. We literally walked backwards together the entire way back, looking to the last area we had seen it. We stood on the veranda, having a cigarette again, trying to calm our nerves and trying to make sense of what we just saw. Just when I was about to say Wendigo, and I mean I got as far as saying it probably, when we heard something screaming right by the driveway. The sound made us freeze in our spots. It was a scream we had never heard before. And mind you, we know what mountain lions and other animals sound like, but this wasn't no earthly animal. We stayed in place once again, trying to find it with a flashlight, but we couldn't. We didn't see much of anything. We saw no movement, and we even flinched when the dogs had suddenly showed up out of nowhere, but that's when we realized something. The entire time we hadn't noticed the dogs weren't around. After all, they usually followed us when we walked around. We took the dogs coming out as a sign it had left. My nephew and I agree that we hope we never see or hear it again. And I don't blame the dogs for hiding. If I knew it was in that field, I would have hid too. Hello guys. Today's episode features a terrifying tale that happened on a reservation. As a half Navajo and Hopi, I've had my share of experiences on and off the Navajo and Hopi reservation. I hope that I won't get any ridicule from other Native Americans for posting these stories. One experience that I'd like to share happened when I was 14 years old. I'm 29 now, so you can do the math. This was an experience that I've only shared with a small number of people, and that I'm now writing down for the first time. My brother, who's now a hardened soldier, is still scared about what happened to us this particular evening. Anyway, on with the story. As a teenager, I'd visit my grandmother at her home on the Navajo reservation for several weeks every summer, and I'd spend time with her, eat her delicious bread, and hear all her stories. Every so often, my grandmother would hire a worker to do odd jobs around her house and property. It was usually the harmless town drunk that she had hired. One evening, right before sundown, I had asked my grandmother to take him home, which was about 4 miles outside of the valley. Seeing that I was only 14 years old and being asked to drive a truck, I was more than happy to. Mind you, I was on the razz that nobody really cares that you're 14 years old and driving around. Hell, there's hardly anybody out there to see anyway. My 9-year-old brother jumped in the truck cab with me, while this worker and my dog shared the tailgate of the truck. After I dropped the worker off at the shack that he and his brother called a house, we headed back down the road to Grandma's. As mentioned before, it was evening and the sky was a deep red as the sun began to set behind us. We were leaving a nice dust trail from the dirt road, and the radio was playing music from the only station that could be picked up from the nearest town of Holbrook, Arizona. There was nothing unusual, nothing weird. It was at this time that my eye caught movement of something in the bushes, a little up the road, right ahead of us. I remember slowing down, thinking that it was one of the free-roaming sheep in the area that would dart out in front of the truck. As I passed where I thought I saw it, I sped up, thinking nothing else of it. Then, out of nowhere, I just felt this dark feeling of fear and dread. I had no idea why I was feeling this way, but I definitely felt something was weird. Yes, I play this memory back in my mind. There are only a few clear memories that I have of that evening. I clearly remember looking back in my rearview mirror and seeing a dark silhouette of something very tall and very skinny that seemed to be covered in some kind of hair or fur running behind the truck after us. Whatever it wasn't a normal human or even human at all. I remember hearing my brother crying and my dog barking ferociously at whatever was chasing us. I remember speeding very fast and shaking violently as the truck bounced on the washboard dirt road. I distinctly remember that this thing was getting closer as my brother cried, "It's coming up on your side." I remember being scared as hell and thinking that I didn't want to die. At the moment that I thought would be our last, I remember speeding around a bend in the road and seeing a car coming up towards us in the opposite direction. At that moment, I felt instant relief and thought that whatever was following us was gone. Shaken up but still alive, we made it to my grandma's house, wondering what the hell had just happened. We ran inside, not looking back, hoping whatever was chasing us hadn't followed us home. Yes, we told Grandma about our experience, but she didn't seem too surprised, which in turn surprised us. She continued by repeating stories that we had already heard at one point or another, talking about black magic, witches, and something about the Navajo Skuli Nerdlushi, skinwalkers. Without going too deep into explanation, I'll just say that these skinwalkers are evil men and spirits that use black magic for evil doing. One can only become a skinwalker by killing a close friend or relative, and us Navajo don't like to talk about them because it's believed that once you acknowledge them, they'll find you. I tell you that as far-fetched as it sounds, they are real. I believe that if God and His greatness are real, the devil is equally as real, and also has his way of showing himself. Needless to say, I didn't even want to look out of the window for the rest of the night. As a matter of fact, I never drove on the reservation at night again until I was 21 years old. This might not sound particularly scary to some, but what happened that evening really did happen and scared the living crap out of me. I invite anybody to visit this part of Arizona, and if you have any doubts or want a huge scare, I promise you won't be disappointed. Did you like the story? Check out our channel for more.